He says an invisible force was pressing him forward, into a gap that had opened between two chained men. Around them, hundreds of thousands of people, pale as ash, chained to a pillar taller than anything on earth, shuffling in a slow, grinding circle. He got so close he could have reached out and touched the man's shoulder, and that's when he saw his own arms. They had turned ash white, like theirs. 20 minutes earlier, by his own account, this man had been lying on a bunk in a prison cell. He isn't a pastor. He isn't selling a book. He has said himself that telling this story is the last thing he wants to do. And maybe that's exactly why it's so hard to dismiss. Out of respect for him, we won't use his name in this video, but his testimony is public in his own words, and we've linked it below. What he describes is not a warning for murderers or criminals. It concerns even people who might go to church or might do good deeds to others. By the way, there is weird detail about the inmate's hands. He cannot explain it to this day, but we will come back to it later in the testimony. This is his testimony about what lies ahead for many. 9 o'clock. Count time. He returned to his single-man cell and lay down on his bunk. The night was cold, he remembers, and he pulled the blanket up over his head. Even through the fabric, he could see the pale hallway light glowing through the small square window in his steel door. A detail so ordinary, so specific, that it anchors everything that follows. And then, in a fraction of a second, the light was gone. Not dimmed. Gone. A blackness so total that his first thoughts were mundane. A power outage. An eclipse. He held his hand in front of his face and saw nothing. He wiped his eyes. Nothing. His blanket was gone. The bunk was gone. He was propped on one elbow, lying exactly as he had been, but now on a cold stone floor, in a darkness he says was thick enough to feel. And then he says, a realization arrived that he cannot explain. In his heart, he knew he was somewhere else. He had grown up in church, 3 services a week. He had always pictured hell as fire. But what he describes is different, and it aligns perfectly with what Bible tells us. Not flames, but what Matthew's gospel calls the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. He began to cry out, "Lord, I'm a Christian. There's been some kind of mistake." And the moment he did, something above him woke up. 2 pairs of eyes opened in the black, enormous, yellow-orange, glowing like something radioactive. One pair sat lower than the other. They wrapped around the sides of unseen heads, reptilian, and yet, this is the detail he keeps returning to. Their glow illuminated nothing. Not a face, not a wall. Only the eyes themselves, floating in the dark. They began to descend toward him, slowly. Focusing on him, he says, like a lens. He admits he doesn't know whether he was screaming with his mouth or his mind. He only knows his teeth were rattling so hard he bit down on his own hand. Then something seized him from behind. It wrapped around him and lifted him straight up, through the ceiling, through stone, and suddenly he was moving backward through open darkness. He describes the strangest detail of all. Total silence. No atmosphere, no sound from the creatures. A vacuum in which the only voice was his own. Looking back, he saw where he had been held. A black, medieval-looking prison, 4 stories high, stretching farther than he could see, with massive stone steps climbing its face. He was certain of 2 things. He was deep beneath the earth, and 20 seconds earlier, he had been lying in his cell. The grip released him, and he stood alone in nothing. He turned a full circle, darkness in every direction, and there, he says, his whole life rose up before him, and he began pleading his case. He had gone to church 3 times a week, attended a Christian school, won a Sunday school ribbon for memorizing the most verses. Surely that counted. Surely there had been a mistake. But listen to what he says he understood in that moment. Because it is the theological heart of this entire testimony. You think you know what eternity feels like. You don't. He felt separation from God. Final, total, unending. He believed he had died in his cell and that there would never be another chance. Not in 1,000 years, not ever. And then, far in the distance, he saw a tiny point of white light, like a galaxy glimmering in the middle of the void. The presence seized him again, and they began moving toward it. Here is where his account becomes almost unbearable to hear. As they flew, he was screaming that he was saved, listing the good things he had done. And he noticed something. The more he defended himself, the tighter the grip became. Hold on to that detail. It matters later. The light grew until it revealed a scene he says he could never have imagined. A wall stretching for miles, a dark sky of blackish clouds, and at the center, a pillar so immense that a redwood would look like a toothpick beside it, ringed at its base by a colossal steel collar. Then he heard the chains. Around that pillar, he says, moved hundreds of thousands of people, pale, drained, ash white, as if no blood remained in them. Every nation, every age, he could still distinguish them. All chained to the pillar, all shuffling in a slow, grinding circle, all making a sound he refuses to imitate, like people trying to scream without voices. And he noticed he was the only one calling out for Jesus. The others had stopped hoping. Scripture speaks of beings kept in everlasting chains under darkness, awaiting judgment. The letter of Jude describes exactly that. He had won ribbons for memorizing verses. But he says nothing had prepared him to hear the agony in chains. Above the crowd moved the only thing in that entire place that had color. It was tethered by a chain to the top of the pillar. A hovering mass the size of a car, made of what he can only describe as billions of slithering, pale blue strands. No face, no eyes. And wherever it passed over the crowd, the people beneath it convulsed in terror. When it noticed him, it crossed the whole distance in a moment and stopped 10 feet above his head. It simply hovered there, watching him without a face, and the invisible force began pressing him into a gap that had opened between two prisoners, a place in the chain line, his place. He looked down at his own arms. They had turned ash white, like theirs. Only his thumbs, he says, still showed living skin. And here is the moment the entire testimony hinges on. He stopped defending himself. He stopped listing the church attendance, the memorized verses, the good deeds. He raised his hands into the dark and said something he had never truly said before. God, please forgive me. I'm a sinner. And instantly, the grip released him. Remember, the more he justified himself, the tighter it held. The moment he confessed, it let go. Whatever you make of this story, that is not the moral a man invents to flatter himself. That is the tax collector's prayer from Luke chapter 18. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The prayer Jesus said sends a man home justified, while the religious man's resume sends him home empty. He says he understood, in that instant, what the crowd around that pillar had in common. Every one of them had believed they were saved. Churchgoers, good people, people who were not like those other sinners. A place, he says, for the lukewarm. And anyone who has read Revelation as chapter 3 hears the echo. Because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spit you out of my mouth. He ran along the endless line of the chained into the outer dark until he reached the corner of ancient ruins and heard something screaming. At first, it sounded like a man being tortured, and he pitied him. But the scream went on too long, 45 seconds, a minute. No human lungs could do that. He looked up and saw an arched doorway 100 feet high, medieval, carved from black stone, and on a broken ledge near its top sat a giant, winged, but not with feathers. Skin wings, he says, like a bat's. It sat there screaming into the dark. Pain, then rage, then silence, then again. He offers no interpretation of what it was. He simply tells you what he saw. The next thing he remembers is tree roots and earth rushing past. And then he was sitting upright in his cell. 3 a.m, soaked through with sweat, shaking so violently he couldn't form words. His eyes locked onto the hallway nightlight through the door's glass window. The same light that had vanished hours before, and he could not look away from it. About 15 minutes later, a correctional officer passed, shined a light through the window, walked on, then came back. You all right? Nightmare or something? He couldn't answer. But as soon as he could move, he was face down on the floor of that cell, begging God for forgiveness. This time, he says, meaning it. We cannot prove what happened in that cell that night. No one can. He himself has said this kind of retelling is not his cup of tea. He shares it reluctantly, which is perhaps worth noting. What we can say is this: he is not alone. Across decades and continents, people with no connection to each other have described strikingly similar experiences. The darkness, the silence, the sensation of final separation. Each account stands or falls on its own, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. And 2 months after that night, he says he was given one more glimpse, this time of a mountainside, filled with light, where he saw the great-grandmother who had helped raise him. That, he says, is another story. What did he carry out of the darkness? Not a message for murderers and monsters, a message for church people, for the good, for the almost saved. That religious activity is not relationship. That a resume of good deeds tightens the grip rather than loosening it. And that one honest sentence, "God forgive me, I'm a sinner," breaks chains that decades of church attendance never touched. Whatever you believe about his story, that part is simply what the book has always said. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. If this testimony moved you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories in future. The original account is publicly available. Details in the description. Search for God and you will receive him.